Evening, guys. Hopefully you are having a good night. Hopefully the snow has not gotten you in any sort of trouble with your driving. We'll get started with a review session in just a couple minutes once I make sure that the stream is working. Obviously, you can put your questions over on the right-hand side. I see some questions for tonight. It looks like the list is relatively short for this evening, coming from the 3 classes. And again, I'm hoping that means that you are in a really good spot. But let me make sure that the link is working and everything is good. I see a number of you guys here already, so hopefully everything is working well for you. Volume's working too, so we're good. All right. So from this point forward, please make sure you put any questions over onto the right-hand side so I'm able to get those taken care of for you this evening. And we'll be taking a look at chapters 30 through 32 tonight. Test tomorrow when you come to class. Bring your notes with you. Drop them off on the desk when you walk in the door. And then this upcoming week, we'll be reading chapters 33 and 34. They deal with World War II, and so we'll be taking a look at World War II. It really should just be one big chapter dealing with the war and what was happening here on the home front. And they dedicate a good amount of time to the strategies of the war, which, as we've talked about in class, you need to know beginnings, turning points, endings. So there's a lot of stuff in chapter 32 that I'll be covering for you quickly in class. And I do plan on starting to dive into that on Wednesday when we get together to be able to cover this content before the end of the week is done. The following week, the Tuesday, we don't have school. We've got ACT going on. So it'll only be 11th graders who are in school. So we'll see what we're doing with the test date. And my hope is to have the test on Monday so that we're able to then be done through period 7. And then all we'll have left for the months of March and April and part of May is periods 8 and 9. And then doing a whole lot of review to be able to help you guys to get into a good spot. So let's get started. And what I'm going to be doing, I see that I've got a question in period 1 and a question in period 2, but I'm actually going to jump to period 4 to get to the big idea of what you're supposed to be noticing when you're working your way through this chapter. And in particular, what we want to be considering, and I stole my wife's whiteboard. I taught her the technology that she's using for her review sessions with kids, and she's got obviously a much better technology. So imagine this is your curve that you learned about A and E cycles when it comes to your boom and bust. We need to talk about the different philosophies that are being discussed inside your chapter as far as how to deal with a crash. And so what you've seen in the past is that whenever the crash comes, like we've seen Panic of 1873, 83, and 93, the economy then is usually just allowed to kind of bottom out. And the feeling was that this is the way that free market economics should be working, that the economy should be allowed to crash, clean out all the companies that need to go bankrupt, and then the economy could get better. Your dilemma that you have is in the Panic of 1893 and the Panic of 1929, you have some issues. What if the banking system breaks down and nobody can get a loan to buy stuff and the economy stays bad? What if you've got a problem where the government gets so deeply in debt that they need to go to a multimillionaire like a JP Morgan to get out of their situation that they're running into? And in particular, when it comes to economics, it's fine to say that the way that the market should work is with free market philosophies, laissez-faire, hands-off business. Your problem is in the same year, 1932, that Franklin Roosevelt becomes president, Adolf Hitler becomes the leader of Germany, and he's going to be able to ride economic downturns into a philosophy of anti-Semitism, totalitarian dictatorship, nationalism. And like we talked about in the past, nationalism is not just patriotism, it's so much more, with the idea of a superiority that's going on. And it becomes a very dangerous style of government. So we're going to find for Franklin Roosevelt, he's going to not be okay with the idea of doing nothing, but Herbert Hoover is the same. What we want to be noticing, though, is during the period of 1929 to 1937, you're going to see that when Franklin Roosevelt puts his New Deal into place, the economy does make progress and unemployment starts dropping. Your question, though, is Are the conservatives right or are the liberals right as far as why the economy started getting better? For liberals, they'll argue that it was the New Deal that helped to make the economy get better. It didn't fix the Great Depression, only World War II did. For conservatives, though, their argument is going to be that Franklin Roosevelt's intervention is making things worse. The dilemma, though, is we're going to find over the course of the 20th and into the 21st centuries, the philosophy that's come up with during this time period is going to be something that becomes embraced both back then and nowadays, and it's called Keynesian economics. They finish up chapter 32 by talking about this, and so one of your classmates asked about this during the period for message board. So when we think about Keynesian economics, there's a guy named John Maynard Keynes who's in England, and he's been writing about economics, but no president has really listened to his philosophies because it is really different than what we had previously. And so when you think about previous presidents all the way up until this time, their obsession has been debt. And one of the things you should notice with chapter 32 is Franklin Roosevelt is obsessed with debt as well. He doesn't want to go so deeply into debt that he feels like it's going to create a drag on our economy. And he's fearful that many people are already accusing him of being a radical. And then going deeply into debt on top of that scares a lot of people because the only way you can pay that back is if the wealthy start paying taxes. For Keynesian economics, though, the idea that John Maynard Keynes has is when we talk about these cycles, we learn about A through E cycles when we were playing our Steel Empire game. And John Maynard Keynes is pointing out that when you get to an A cycle, you're forming a bubble that could blow up and cause an economic crash. And when you get down to an E cycle, you have blown up everything. And so what John Maynard Keynes is talking about instead is, can we manage our economy to get rid of these booms and get rid of these crashes so that we don't have the deep crash or the massive boom? That means you're not going to have a roaring 20s again where you can buy on margin and make millions, but it also means hopefully no more Great Depressions. So what they mentioned to you in your textbook is Franklin Roosevelt never truly embraced Keynesian economics until we actually got to World War II. And when we get to World War II, you're going to see how his philosophies then are going to cause an economic turnaround because of the fact that what he's talking about doing is when the economy crashes, he believes in doing these two things. So when the economy crashes down here, what he's thinking is that we should cut taxes, which Republicans will like quite a bit. But at that same moment, he believes that we should increase government spending. And what he believes is we should even go so much as during that time period to go into debt. That's going to end up looking kind of pink. So let me try a different one. And the term that I want to be able to use from this point forward is for John Maynard Keynes. He believes that if we go into debt at this deep point, government spending then can create a stimulus like you guys saw with like the works programs or the TVA or whatever. And the hope is that by putting money into these people's pockets, they can then create demand, buying stuff from businesses. The businesses could then hire more workers. And then hopefully once the economy gets better, you can then cut that out. Now, for John Maynard Keynes, his philosophy then is you're going to go into debt. And so what that means is when the economy gets better, you're going to flip the whole equation. His feeling is when the economy gets better, you increase taxes. Take money away from people who are making money, take it to pay down this debt that you guys built up during the time period of the crash. And what'll happen is by taking money out of people's pockets, it will calm down these booms so people aren't doing reckless things with their money. But then hopefully, if you're managing the economy, you should be able to cut government spending for like welfare programs, works programs, or those sorts of things to help make get rid of government spending, bring us back to normal. And so he sees this as almost like a gas pedal and brake. Give a little bit of gas here, give a little bit of brake here so that the economy doesn't get out of control. Now, our dilemma is when we think about where we are nowadays, Americans very much like government spending and they also very much like low taxes. And so, one of the dilemmas that we have is even though we know this philosophy is out there, we don't really embrace it fully for the painful, unhappy parts because who wants to be the politician saying we're going to cut programs or increase taxes? But that's what's going on when you take a look at Keynesian economics. So, if you have any questions over on the right hand side, feel free to post there. But when it comes to the New Deal, if somebody says, oh, New Deal's on the wrong track, they were doing all the wrong things, the dilemma that they have is they have to then explain World War II. And with World War II, it is like the New Deal on steroids because we have an economy that's gone bad. We're going to have massive amounts of government borrowing that's going to hire everybody we can to either work in a factory or work as a soldier. That will then create the stimulus that we need, and the economy will then rebound. Not because of laissez-faire economics, but because of this intervention that comes from a war. And because it is a war, you can't argue against it like you could like a TVA, WPA, or those sorts of things. Hopefully you're good. So that's what I wanted to start off with tonight, just to give you that perspective. I'm going to be running through that again on Wednesday, though, when we get to class, so I can talk to you about how do we look at World War II. Because when you're reading about World War II and you're reading about like factories, Rosie the Riveter, soldiers, and those sorts of things, the war itself is important, but also what it does on the home front. We're going to come back from World War II, end the Great Depression, and move into the 40s and the 50s, into what, if you listen to President Trump's fans, it's the time period that's referred to as the time when America was great. And so making America great again is referencing the period that we're about to move into. So I'm going to get started with period one and start working my way through the questions. Finn, I see your question over on the right-hand side, so I will get to that as well. So I see in period one a question: what was Britain's role in the Great Depression? When we think about Britain's role in the Great Depression, we're going to find that the Great Depression is not just a local crash, it is a gigantic international crash. And the problem that we have internationally is if we think about the places that are going to be involved in the crash itself, imagine that you've got the United States and England and France and Germany, and the World War I has just ended. So we're only a decade removed from World War I when we get to the Great Depression. When we take a look at the map that you have right here, England and France owed tons of money to the United States, and the United States told them that they couldn't get away without repaying their debts. Germany had been destroyed by World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, and they owed England and France money. And what Germany decided to do is they decided to just start printing money. There was a moment at the start of President Trump's presidency where I'm hoping he was joking, because he floated the idea of what if you created a piece of currency that was like $1 trillion note that you could give to China and get rid of some of our debt. And fortunately, his economist said to him, if you do that, you're then adding $1 trillion to our money supply, and that would then cause massive hyperinflation of everything. Prices would go out of whack. That's what's happened in Germany. So Germany, it takes like a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread. And when Germany and England and France ask America for help, they get the Dawes Plan. America is going to give loans to Germany. Germany's going to give that money to England and France. They're going to send it back to the United States. But then also remember, we created a gigantic tariff on European goods, which means they can't sell stuff to repay what they owe. And so they're already in rough shape. And then when 1929 comes and our banks, stock market, farms, all those things go bad, our country was the only really major, fully functioning, good economy during this time period. And then we're not. You're going to find then that European countries are going to be tempted to become radical, especially like Adolf Hitler with Nazi Germany, because Hitler's going to realize before the United States, you want to fix the Great Depression, hire all your unemployed men to be soldiers or factory workers, with the idea that you're the greatest country on the planet, you're going to attack your neighbors. That helps them to get out of the Depression. It also leads to the horrible Holocaust and destruction that we see there. So that's the only question I see for period one, asking about Britain's role. See a question here. Do we need to know all of the parts of the New Deal? Simply put, you have to be able to talk about each of the programs that you have on your study chart to be able to understand what is going on with the New Deal and how Franklin Roosevelt's trying to deal with the crash. You need to be able to talk about what the programs are, what they're trying to accomplish, criticisms of them, which is the reason why I told you chapter 32 is a pretty heavy lift. So hopefully that study chart is finished up so you can look it over and have some ideas about that. But work on grouping things. You can see the question that Finn has of what are the differences between the PWA and the WPA. You should notice that Franklin Roosevelt really falls in love with works programs, and he very much is of the idea that giving somebody a handout makes them dependent on the government, and it takes away their pride and their work ethic. So you'll find that Franklin Roosevelt is creating one work program after another. The CCC is different. It's focused on conservation efforts. And you'll notice that his distant relative, Teddy Roosevelt's influence can be seen here because they're going to be building parks like up in the Boundary Waters or Gooseberry Falls or whatever. And that's going to be building the parks out that Teddy Roosevelt envisioned a couple decades earlier. When you get to the PWA and the WPA, though, those are going to be happening more in urban areas. And the WPA is the biggest one of them all, where after the criticism of Huey Long, Franklin Roosevelt starts hiring pretty much anybody who has any sort of skill set to be doing any things to get money in their pockets because people are starting to radicalize. So he's paying people to like paint murals and to collect the oral histories of former slaves in the South and a whole host of other things on top of building roads and bridges and that sort of stuff. So to kind of get to your question, do you need to know all the parts of Roosevelt's New Deal? If you can figure out ways to group them together where these are the ones that are dealing with banking, these are the ones that are dealing with works programs, that'll make your life easier. But I cannot say it's going to be easy. So hopefully you guys are doing okay. Period 1 is now done. I'm flipping to period 2. So let me see here. I see a question. How did Republicans criticize the New Deal? The New Deal is going to be criticized in a number of different ways. Number one, there's going to be the criticisms that are coming from Herbert Hoover that the government is getting too big. And Herbert Hoover is going to stand off to the side. And now that he's an ex-president, he'll poke at all these different programs that Roosevelt is doing and claim that they're too extreme for the United States. The Supreme Court is going to argue that these laws are unconstitutional. So they're going to use the power of judicial review to determine that the federal government is not allowed to do these things because of strict constructionism, the stuff that we were talking about during Hamilton and Jefferson's time. Republicans were also really nervous, and they would oftentimes label any of the programs as being creeping socialism, that this was essentially the ruin of the United States by stepping in these sorts of ways. And then finally, Republicans were really nervous about debt both back then and nowadays. And so they were very concerned about the price tag for all of what Roosevelt was doing. Especially they were hyper conscious about debt. And that's the reason why FDR has to do the same, because that's a criticism that many Americans understood. The only problem was philosophically, there were people who understood economics who were trying to say that at certain times, debt is not necessarily bad. And this is one of those lessons that we learned from Alexander Hamilton, where Alexander Hamilton assumed all the state's debts, repaid them at face value or at par. And so we'll find that we're kind of back to that same conversation also about how do you fund these programs? Because in Alexander Hamilton's viewpoint, debt is not bad if it's done as an investment. And in this case, trying to make sure that people aren't starving and radicalizing is a legitimate conversation point as far as whether or not we should be doing government spending to prevent that from happening. See another question for period 2. It says, how are the New Deal and the Square Deal similar? And so when you think about this, and this is where one of your essays could come from, so this is the way that I would picture it if I was doing this essay. If they were asking you to compare and contrast the New Deal and the Square Deal, and what I would keep in mind then is that for Teddy Roosevelt, relief and recovery are off the table because there wasn't any sort of Great Depression that you needed to focus on, which means anything you put into relief and recovery for Franklin Roosevelt would automatically be a contrast to what Teddy Roosevelt is up to. Now, when it came to reform, you see Franklin Roosevelt reforming like the banks with the Glass-Steagall Act. He's reforming retirement when it comes to Social Security, reforming the stock market with the Security Exchange Commission. And you see Teddy Roosevelt doing some things that are similar with like anti-monopoly laws or the Pure Food and Drug Act or the Meat Inspection Act or those sorts of things. So while they have different industries that they're focused on, they're both focused on reforming institutions that are seen as something that's more than just a private business. It's seen as having some sort of impact on day-to-day life, where if it's left unresolved, the American people are going to be suffering as a result of the lack of government rules because of the fact that the businesses are sometimes cutting corners or doing other things that are unethical. So that's where you want to be noticing. And what I think about is to kind of expand that question instead of thinking how is the New Deal and the Square Deal. Typically, what they'll do is they'll have you compare the New Deal to the Progressive Era, especially because then you could take a look at what's going on with like the Federal Reserve during Woodrow Wilson's time, and the creation of the Glass-Steagall Act during FDR's time. So you do see that they are both focused on the fact that if banking goes wrong, it can have a huge negative impact on people's lives. So let me hit refresh here. That was period 2. I don't see any new questions for period 2, so I'm going to come back to period 4 then. So I've got a few different questions here. The first one is can I explain the Teapot Dome scandal? And I can absolutely do that. Simply put, imagine that you've got an area of the federal government, the federal lands, and they've got a salt dome. So this is a gigantic cavern underneath the ground where salt has been deposited in ancient times. So imagine oceans, the oceans dry, the salt then dries out. And the way that they extract salt from the ground, if they're using the mining technique for that, is they sometimes will pump water down, dissolve the salt, suck it out as salt water, and that leaves a gigantic cavern behind. That's known as a salt dome. So what happened, long story short, the United States Navy was using these salt domes, Teapot Dome, to store oil in case we ever ended up in a war and our oil reserves got cut. So imagine that we've got this oil set aside. If war broke out, then our Navy wouldn't run out. And the guy who's supposed to be watching out for that is the Secretary of the Interior. So that's the guy who's supposed to be watching out for our national park lands and our federal lands, and looking out essentially just to make sure nothing funny is going on with any of those things, to make sure that we're safe and secure. And what this guy does, Albert Fall, is he's going to go to jail. He's going to be our first presidential cabinet member ever thrown in jail. And the reason why that's going to happen is because he's going to accept bribes from oil companies to secretly steal that oil so that they could sell it for people to use in their cars or whatever. And instead of paying money to the federal government, they're giving bribes on the side to Albert Fall, so that he doesn't let anybody know about that. This is something that is obviously corrupt, and in the Harding presidency, which is talking openly about their love of law and order, especially when they are busting speakeasies while having alcohol-fueled parties at the parties of the White House. This is embarrassing. And when it comes to the idea that these people who are doing this are accepting jobs and taking an oath, saying that they're going to uphold and defend the Constitution and do their best in these jobs, there's some unethical stuff that's going on because you still see remnants of the spoil system going on. So hopefully that helps out. The next question that I see is, what was the Schechter decision? And the Schechter decision is also known as the sick chicken decision. And so the Schechter case is a Supreme Court case that is going to rule that New Deal programs are unconstitutional. In this case, it's going to be the AAA. But there's also going to be other court cases that are going to rule the National Recovery Administration also to be unconstitutional. And in particular, what they're worried about is this. Franklin Roosevelt is trying to figure out ways to create rules and regulations to tell certain businesses how much money they can pay people, like a minimum wage, maximum work hours. They're trying to figure out like trade decisions so that they can figure out how not to undercut businesses so they're selling so cheaply that they're driven out of business because the market is totally free. And that's then allowing people to undercut one another and go out of business. So in the Schechter decision, it was argued that rules and regulations on like what you can do with sick chickens, because that was one of the rules that worked its way in. It was a regulation on what farmers could do. The argument was made that that's not something that's supposed to be the federal government's job. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the federal government is supposed to be regulating whether or not chickens can or cannot be sick. States can, local governments can. The federal government might be able to if they create a law, but then even then, the question is, constitutionally, if you interpret the Constitution strictly, there's only a certain number of things the government's allowed to do if you're a strict constructionist. So that's what the Schechter case is about, is it's ruling New Deal programs unconstitutional on the basis of strict constructionism. And it's going to lead to Franklin Roosevelt wanting to pack the court with 6 new justices, because eventually what he starts running into is 1933, 34, 35. He keeps creating these laws, and then the Supreme Court keeps ruling them unconstitutional. And that's the reason why you've got such a headache when you're trying to memorize stuff for this test, because Finn's question that you can see on the postings, what's the difference between the PWA and the WPA? The difference is Franklin Roosevelt, A, is trying to respond with a bigger program because of Huey Long's pressure. But then secondarily, as the Supreme Court finds something unconstitutional, or if it's even potentially going to happen, he'll just create a new program, slightly different with a different name. And then that way, for the Supreme Court to get rid of that one, they would need to then go through the court case, consider it. And during that time, that law would be in effect and doing things to help people out. And so if you are really mad at the number of programs, especially works programs that you have to memorize, you can thank that battle that's going on in the Supreme Court during that time period. Finn, your question about what are the most important aspects of the New Deal, it's really cause and effect. You got to take a look at tomorrow when you come to class, you need to be able to explain, here are the things that went wrong with the crash. And when I run down that list, it's foreign trade, it's farmers who are having problems, factory workers losing their jobs. Factories are producing tons of stuff. There's not enough demand. That's going on. Dust Bowl is going on. Banks collapse, stock market collapses. So you have to be able to run that list and think about, not most kids who struggle will think stock market went bad. And there's so much more stuff that's going on. So then you have to address it during Hoover's time. What did he do to try to fix it? So when we think about a question like yours, I'm going to expand it bigger. When you look at Herbert Hoover, he's going to start by doing nothing, rugged individualism, then the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to help get money to businesses. Then he starts creating like programs like Hoover Dam to give people a chance to work. And you'll notice if you ever compare and contrast Hoover and FDR, FDR's works programs and Hoover Dam are along the same path. That's just FDR is going to go much bigger. Hoover gets nervous with the Muscle Shoals project. That becomes Franklin Roosevelt's Tennessee Valley Authority. You should be able to also categorize, though, relief, recovery, reform. To understand what is FDR trying to do. And then we should also think about what's going on with Keynesian economics, where there are economists who are liberal who are going to say FDR was on the right track at times. He didn't go far enough. There are other people who are conservatives, though, who will argue that by pulling money to these programs, he's then taking money away from business owners to make their factories bigger. Ignoring the fact that the factories were plenty big during this time period, and our problem was a demand issue. Next question I see right here is, can I explain the 9 Powers Treaty of 1922? So when you think about the Powers Treaties, there's the 5 Powers Treaty, the 9 Power Treaty, and the 4 Power Treaty. They're all part of what's known as the Washington Naval Conference, also described as the Disarmament Conference. So at this meeting, your big, most powerful countries are England, Japan, and the United States. And they decide these things. In the 5 Powers Treaties, they're going to put ratios, a 5-5-3 ratio on what big warships they're allowed to build. The 9 Powers Treaty is going to be protecting the whole structure of the open door policy in China. And the 4 Powers Treaty is an agreement by England and America and Japan that nobody's going to fortify their positions that they have in the Pacific with the fear that that might lead to war. And the problem we're going to have is that in America, they're going to like the idea of not fortifying the Philippines or Guam or other sorts of places because that would be expensive. The problem is if you leave them unfortified, Japan's going to have a much easier time conquering them when World War II breaks out. And we're going to see that happen in 1941. That's going to go pretty bad. The next question I see, can I explain the Farm Credit Administration? And absolutely I can. So when you think about the Farm Credit Administration, it's still around nowadays. The way that the Farm Credit Administration works is it's a structure that you had seen argued for in the whole time period that we've been studying since the late 1800s. And the point that was being made is ever since the time period of like the Grange alliances, farmers have said we're stable, we're conservative, we're hardworking, we are not radical unless we get pushed into radicalism. And what they are saying is they're looking for something kind of like a Federal Reserve, but for farmers. And so when we think about the FCA, the way that it works, imagine that you've got these farmers who took out a loan from their bank, and the bank has got a loan on them that they're not able to pay. The way that the Farm Credit Administration works is this is a government program then that can work directly with farmers. And what it will do is it will take over the loan here and they will be the ones who administer it. And what they'll do is they'll lower the interest rate if there's a good reason to, like let's say there's crop failures or the crash is coming or whatever. And then let's say that you owe this much money over this much time. You'll still owe this much money, but they might stretch it out to this much time with an interest rate that's much lower. So it might take you lower to pay off your loans. But the feeling is that number one, if that loan is taken from the bank, the government would then give the bank the money that you owe them. So the bank is now out of it and they don't go bankrupt. But then for you, it's you get to hold on to your honor, you get to hold on to your land, you get to work with somebody, and the government trusts that you're probably not going to run away, because if they can make the terms reasonable enough, your job is farming. You wouldn't go through the hassle of getting a loan like this if you were planning on dipping out on farming and running away to someplace, because all that you own is put into land and tractors. So the Farm Credit Administration then is meant to try to rework loans for farmers so that instead of just as a whole group, they go bankrupt and then our banking system collapses, we can keep them in business, help them ride through the tough times. And then hopefully, if we make their loan payment monthly lower, they should then be able to survive dropping prices. They should be able to pay their bills. They should be able to buy stuff, which should hopefully then not then crash out the whole economy. The final question I see on my message board is coming at the end of the period 4 section, and so let me get to that one. And the two, both of them have to do with terms, and two of the trickier ones that you see inside your textbook. And so the first one is asking about blank check powers. So the way to look at blank check powers is if an election is a landslide. So imagine that somebody wins overwhelmingly an election, and they get 50 some 60% some percent of the vote, to the point where there's no doubt that they were chosen to be the person to be the president. But let's say also, like, they'll use the term riding in on somebody's coattails, where if you're a popular enough president, you can actually bring along people into government as well. And that's what happened with Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt became president, and the Republicans were so beaten down because of what happened during the crash. They got the blame for the crash and the response to it. They were labeled as do nothing, even though we saw Hoover did plenty to try to turn around the economy. Compared to previous presidents, it just wasn't enough. But what happened is then Franklin Roosevelt was able to get a blank check, which meant he could go to Congress and say, I want you to create this bill. I would like to sign it. Now, if it's a bad idea, people could turn on him in an instant. But essentially, he could look at Congress and say, because I've been chosen and you've come along with me, we can pretty much do what we want to right now for the next couple of years. And then in the next election, the voters will determine if they want to take back that blank check, if they give the House of Representatives to the other party, or the president's victory total is much less. The other question, though, is asking about parity prices. And the parity prices one is one that I'm glad that you found, because of the fact that it's kind of tricky, and it has to do with farmers. And so when we think about the situation in 1929, imagine if in 1929 a farmer was getting paid this much for their crops. What was happening though is during the time period of Warren G. Harding, sorry, Calvin Coolidge, farmers were feeling bad because in 1909 to 1914, they felt they got duped because from 1909 to 1914 they were getting paid this much for their food because they were selling both to the United States and also overseas to Europe. This was during the Underwood Tariff. This is when the trade overseas was easier. But as we move forward in time, farmers are seeing their farm crops getting less and less money, and they're demanding price parity. Now, this is a government control on farm prices, and this makes conservatives during this time period incredibly nervous because what they see as the best thing about the United States is instead of the government choosing how much you make and how much money a product is worth, when the economy goes up and down, if there's an overproduction of stuff, prices then drop because too much has been made. And then over time, what will happen is as you have these low prices, what really should be taking place is you should have farmers quitting. And that's the big dilemma that you have inside this chapter is we really don't know during this time period how to tell a group of people you're doing a job that we have too many people doing already. Not that it's a bad thing to have extra food, but if you're relying on the market, eventually you're going to drive down the prices so low that there's no profit margin for you. Because Republicans and Democrats, though, like having farmers vote for them, instead we're going to have things like the McNary-Haugen bill that Coolidge is going to veto because it's not going to be free market. And what it does is it's going to say we're going to set these artificial prices for food during this time, and what'll happen is if there's any extra food, the government will buy it up and then find a home for it. If you do this, though, the impact it'll have on the market then is you'll have a bunch of farmers who start producing even more and more food. Because if you knew you could make as much food as you wanted to and sell it to the government at prices that were way higher than they should be paying, that's kind of like what you saw going on with the Sherman Silver Purchase Act in the late 1800s. Your problem, though, is Coolidge is going to veto that bill. We'll then get to 1929, and prices are going to crater on food. And so by not maintaining price parity, these farmers can't pay back their loans. They go bankrupt. The banks then get clobbered. The Great Depression happens. And Franklin Roosevelt is going to go another dramatic direction with the AAA, where we're going to pay farmers not to farm, trying to convince them that maybe they should move on. In reality, one of the big questions both back then and nowadays is the even tougher choice. Should we be telling farmers, look, there's no market for you right now, which is tough because a lot of people have put money into their land and their farm goods. We also have starving people around the world who could definitely benefit from food, but that would be a different conversation of giving that to them because they don't have the money to pay for it in large fashion. And so this is one of the big issues that we start walking into nowadays that you get to inherit because right now we have in our society farmers who are both conservative and ruggedly individualistic, but they're also getting farm subsidies and crop insurance from the government so that they don't have to bear the full risk of being a farmer on their own. Hopefully that helps. A little long-winded. If you notice the detail that I went into, I've got farmers on both sides of my family, so that's where I am. That's the last question I see up here, so I'm going to give you a second to see if there's any other questions that need to go into the side of the chat board before I wrap up for this evening. I'm hoping that you are having a very nice 3-day weekend. Today was wonderful. I spent a lot of time thinking about all my favorite presidents, but of course, Abe Lincoln was front and center in my mind. And so it's been a wonderful day thinking about him. After having a chance to focus my wife on Valentine's Day, it's been a fantastic time, but I'm very excited to be back with you guys tomorrow. I don't see any of the questions, so the only other thing I'll say is if you are one of my young drivers, the snow is nasty, the roads are terrible, so be careful getting to school tomorrow. I look forward to seeing you guys, and if you have any other further questions, feel free to email them or see me before class. Have a good night.